The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 7.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now in the 20th century, so we may as well start close to home. And I ask you at the outset to look at American foreign policy, or for that matter, at American domestic policy if you want, and ask yourself what philosophy, if any, guides it. And if you try to extract from the trends of our international or domestic policy a list of philosophic tenets and approaches that are implicit in them, you will come up with some such description philosophically as the following. To begin with, as a country, we go along day by day, following routine, habitual patterns, taking no initiative, doing no new thinking, merely coasting along in some area until some trouble, some catastrophe, some disaster, some major problem arises thrust on us by some sort of forces. One of the latest is the Mideast crisis internationally, or inflation domestically, etc. At that point, the goal of many of our policymakers is simply to get out of the trouble, escape the disaster of the moment, reestablish the status quo, and await the next crisis. What do we do to get out of the trouble? Well, they continue to apply policies, such as, for instance, domestically, growing statism, such as internationally, systematic appeasement, which now goes under the name of negotiation, policies that are demonstrably self-destructive, both in theory and as a matter of actual historical fact. If somebody argues against these policies and tries to argue that they are in principle hopeless, if, for instance, he tries to argue that the growth of government controls has to destroy freedom and has to generate worse problems than the very ones they're allegedly designed to solve. If he tries to argue internationally, for instance, that coalition governments in foreign countries with the communists is only the means of them taking over those countries further and so on, if you try to establish some principles, the answer you get from a great many people is, don't be rigid, abstract, theoretical. There are no absolutes. You can't be certain of anything. We have to study and deal with each concrete situation by itself. Anything might work. How do you know? We have to adopt an attitude of try and see in each case. Rule of thumb in each case. And if someone then were to object and say, but look, after all, we live in reality. And reality is an absolute. It's governed by absolute laws. If you try to say A is A, surely there are some necessary, eternal, absolute facts and truths that we have to adhere to in formulating our policies. The answer you will get from many people is, oh, come on, don't be metaphysical. I'm caught in this particular situation. This is the concrete reality of the moment that I have to deal with. I'm concerned above all with being practical, with what works, with what to do in this particular concrete situation. I'm a man of practicality. And such people frequently add, besides that, I have a consensus of society on my side. And what else can the truth be but that which works for most people? Well, now, the sort of people that enunciate the views in this description that I've just given you, the sort of people who deny the existence of absolute facts and principles that we can know for certain, who judge concretes in a vacuum and declare that their only concern is practicality and that whatever ideas satisfy enough people work and therefore are true, these people are daily men on the street type advocates of the philosophy of pragmatism. And that is the philosophy we are going to begin this evening. Now, the term pragmatism was introduced by Charles Peirce, P-E-I-R-C-E, His dates, if you wish to know, are 1839 to 1914. He's an American philosopher. And the term pragmatism comes from the Greek word pragma, which means deed or act or practice. So pragmatism literally means practicism or practicalism. And as the name would suggest to you, the pragmatists claim that philosophy hitherto has not been practical. It's been too removed from life. It has lost itself in a maze of non-this-worldly concerns. It's retreated into noumenal worlds a la Kant, absolute minds a la Hegel, Platonic forms a la you-know-who. Whereas they say, the pragmatists say, the purpose of theory is action, successful action. The purpose of philosophy should be to guide man's practical activities here on earth. And therefore they say we need a radically different approach to philosophy. Philosophy needs to be reconstructed, as they put it, needs to be overhauled, reconceived, reconstrued, in order to make it relevant to our daily, this-worldly practical concerns. So pragmatism announces itself first and foremost as a philosophy for practical success here on earth. And this claim of the pragmatist is, of course, one of the major keys to their success. One of their major selling points was that they declared, we are going to give you a philosophy for life on earth to guide you in your actual practical actions. This philosophy, I may say, of pragmatism had particular influence in America. There were European variants of it, but it never caught on in Europe to the extent that it did in America. I may mention, just parenthetically, that pragmatism is no longer a very live issue in the academic, professional world today. It's pretty dead among professional philosophers now, although it was one of the major influences in the first 3 or 4 decades of this century. It still, of course, survives and has a great many effects, in part on later philosophies which are derivatives from pragmatism, as we'll see in the next weeks. And in part, pragmatism survives in its effects on society in general, where it's still enormously influential. A word about the founders of pragmatism. It is generally regarded as the product of 3 major figures, all American philosophers. One is Charles Peirce, whom I mentioned, 1839 to 1914. And in 1878, he wrote an article entitled How to Make Our Ideas Clear. How to Make Our Ideas Clear, which is regarded as the historical basis for the development of American pragmatism. We'll be referring to some of its themes shortly. Peirce put forth certain theories that were later picked up and developed by William James, who was 1842 to 1910, and he is commonly regarded as the real founder of pragmatism because he developed what is known as the pragmatist theory of truth, which is the core of the pragmatist theory. And he developed it by expanding on the suggestion implicit in Peirce, as we'll see. And then we should mention, thirdly, of course, John Dewey, for many years professor of philosophy at Columbia. His dates are 1859 to 1952, and he is responsible for developing pragmatism fully across the board in its most influential form as a complete systematic outlook on philosophy. There's one other quite well-known American pragmatist that I'll quote occasionally, so I should let you know of his existence. F.C.S., those are initials, Schiller, S-C-H-I-L-L-E-R, 1846 to 1937. He taught for quite some time at the University of Southern California, and although he doesn't have the stature in the movement that the other 3 men I mentioned do, he is a good orthodox pragmatist of a certain type, and we'll quote from him occasionally. Now, this evening I want to cover the essence of the pragmatist approach to epistemology and metaphysics. Next week, we will look at the applications of the points that we covered this evening to ethics, to politics, perhaps say a word on the influence on American education, and then we will engage in some critical analysis of the theory we're presenting this evening. And of course, we also have logical positivism next week, so we have a full schedule next week. But this evening, I confine myself simply to a presentation of the essential metaphysics and epistemology of pragmatism. Now, the best way to understand the pragmatist approach to philosophy is to see how their philosophy can be developed from the theories of traditional historical philosophers. You can plunge in with a number of different traditional philosophers who were themselves not pragmatists, but take certain of their key ideas, ask a few questions, push their theories in a certain direction, and the result will be you can end up with pragmatism. And I want to show you how you can derive pragmatism from a number of different historical sources by simply emphasizing in a certain direction things that traditional philosophers laid down. And there are at least three related types of development that I think will be illuminating for you to understand the origins of pragmatism. You can get pragmatism by starting with Descartes and pushing him in a certain direction. You can get it by starting with Hegel. And most importantly, of course, you can get it by starting from Kant. And I want to look at each of these in the order I mentioned as they could be construed to lead you to pragmatism. Now, we said very little about Descartes in this course. Indeed, as I remember, we said nothing at all. But he was regarded as the father of modern philosophy, 17th century philosopher. And in starting his philosophy, he had raised the question, how can we be certain of anything? His main goal as a philosopher was to establish something of which we could be absolutely certain. To establish absolute certainty, he worked out a method which he called, or which is subsequently called, Cartesian doubt, meaning simply doubt as practiced by Descartes. And Cartesian doubt is the method of establishing certainty by means of doubting everything that you could conceivably doubt. Anything for which there's even the most slender grounds to doubt, you doubt. And by that means, said Descartes, we can hope finally to find something that resists our most strenuous efforts to doubt it. And when we find that, we will have the rock of Gibraltar, the absolutely certain foundation on which we can then erect a completely indubitable philosophy. To apply this method, Descartes then began to start doubting wherever he thought he could doubt something. And it turned out, of course, that he could doubt everything. If you were inventive enough to come up with some reason to doubt. Could you doubt the evidence of your senses? Well, yes, said Descartes, our senses can deceive us. How do you know that they are not deceiving you in any particular case? Maybe it's not very likely, but if there's a chance in a million, you can't be sure. We have to throw that out as not absolutely certain. Can you doubt your memory? You have a vivid recollection, for instance, of having attended a lecture last week. Could you be wrong about that? Well, says Descartes, theoretically it's possible. Memory plays tricks. Human beings might misremember something, therefore you can't be absolutely certain of the deliverances of your memory. Well, suppose I give you a simple argument like, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Could I possibly be wrong in deriving that conclusion from those premises in my sheer process of reasoning? To which Descartes' answer was, yes, human beings can commit fallacies. It's possible. When you reason to think, your conclusion follows absolutely, and yet you've committed an error. How do you know you didn't commit an error? So even our logical reasoning, no matter how impeccably clear it seems, is suspect, and we can't be certain of any of the conclusions that it leads us to. He went on with many other types of example, but to abstract the type of problem that he posed, he put it, his philosophy amounts to this, to presenting us with this problem. Human beings are fallible. They're capable of error. They can believe something and yet be wrong. On the other hand, to say that you're certain about something is to say that you cannot be wrong. Say, you know this, you just can't be wrong. Well, how can a fallible being be certain? That was the problem that Descartes posed. If he's fallible, he's capable of error, and yet if you say he's certain, it means he can't be wrong about that question. And how is a being who is capable of error ever to be in a position of saying, I know I can't be wrong? Now, I may mention that Descartes thought that he had found an answer to this. His answer is very famous. He thought the one thing he couldn't possibly be wrong about was that he existed in order to do the thinking. He said, even if you tell me I'm thinking incorrectly, at least I have to exist in order to do the thinking. And thus his famous line, I think, therefore I am, which of course you must know in Latin, cogito ergo sum, which just means I think, therefore I am, which he thought was infallible and was the solid rock on which he would base all of his subsequent conclusions. This is a parenthetical aside because, just for historical accuracy, later philosophers said, by the very same argument that Descartes used to throw everything else out, we can throw his cogito out also. How can we be absolutely certain of that? After all, it just is a logical argument, and if we can't trust logic, we can't trust the cogito argument either. And therefore they drew from Descartes' conclusions the conclusion of traditional skepticism, that nobody can know anything for certain at all, since human beings are fallible. In other words, many philosophers drew the conclusion that the quest for certainty is doomed to failure about anything. Now, I may say at this point that pragmatists agree emphatically with this conclusion. You cannot be certain about anything. Peirce, for instance, is referred to as a fallibilist. A fallibilist being somebody who says man is fallible and therefore can be certain of nothing. And here is a one-sentence quote from Peirce. Quote, he throws in a few other things you can't have besides certainty, but it'll give you the idea. Quote, there are three things which we can never hope to attain, namely absolute certainty, absolute exactitude, and absolute universality, unquote. The rest, I guess, you can obtain. All right, so let's establish, so far you can't be certain of anything. But now, traditionally, concepts such as truth and knowledge had been defined in terms of certainty. Traditionally, it would have been regarded as a contradiction to say you know something and yet you're not certain of it. If I say I know I'm giving a lecture right now, but I'm not sure, you'd say that's a contradiction. If you know it with certainty. Well, then, if certainty is built into the concept of knowledge or the concept of truth, and you claim that certainty is impossible, it follows that we could have no knowledge, that knowledge is impossible on this skeptical view. But if no knowledge is possible, since knowledge is our only means of guiding action, it follows that we have no means of knowing how to act, no means of knowing how to live, that we're just simply stuck in a kind of skeptical paralysis. At this point, we can say the pragmatist enters the scene. And he says, I grant you that we can't know anything for certain. That much I grant you. But nevertheless, it's still true that some ideas work better than others. Some ideas, it's better, practically speaking, for us to believe than others, as evidenced by their consequences. Now, to be sure, we can't know that the ones that work better are, quote, really true, that that's the way things really are, but we don't have to say that's the way things really are. Let's simply say that the purpose of thought is not to attain some unattainable certainty about the way things really are, but simply practical, to achieve practical ends. Let's redefine the very concept of truth. We'll abandon the idea that there's a reality out there, that there's a consciousness in here inside each of our heads, and that the consciousness is attempting to recognize or grasp the nature of reality. The pragmatists dispense entirely with that model. They say if you hold that view, that there's a consciousness as distinct from an existence, and consciousness is trying to grasp the nature of existence, since we can never know anything for certain, we simply end up in skepticism and paralysis. Therefore, we have to abandon that model of what constitutes true and simply say an idea is true if and to the extent that it works. If we accept this viewpoint, then truth will still have a role in human life. An idea we can still talk significantly about an idea being true because we'll have a criterion now. Not that it reflects some unknowable reality, but that it gives us practical advice. If we deny this interpretation, then we're caught in the paralysis of the skeptics. Now, this is one way, you see, that you can get to pragmatism, and it reveals the true skeptical basis of pragmatism. The pragmatist's whole philosophy starts with the idea you cannot know the way things really are. Therefore, we must reconceive what truth consists of. Now let's see how you could get pragmatism from Hegel and the Hegelians. Now you recall that the Hegelians were idealists. Everything that exists for them is fundamentally mind, consciousness, spirit, and what we call existence or reality is merely a state or product of consciousness, a content of consciousness. Remember, as we put this point when we were discussing Hegel, the Hegelians abandoned the distinction between consciousness and existence, as we also put it between mind and matter, between subject and object, the object being the thing you're supposed to know out there in reality, the subject being man's mind, man's conscious processes. And recall then that the Hegelians had to ask the question, what then could make an idea true? Truth for them could no longer be a matter of an idea's correspondence to reality, because that presupposed a fundamental distinction between the mind and reality, and they had obliterated and abandoned that distinction. And you remember they had said that truth is a matter of an idea's coherence, its relationship to the other ideas we accept, its ability to fit into the system of our ideas. And you recall that they said also man is fallible. And when asked what happens if an idea coheres today and not tomorrow, when new situations arise, I'm just reminding you now, a point that we made several weeks ago, they said, so long as man is finite, it's always possible that his particular system of truths will need revision. What coheres today may not cohere tomorrow. We may have to constantly alter our ideas. In this sense, they said none of our human truths is absolute until we reach the stage of omniscience, which the later Hegelians said we reach at infinity. At that point, we'll reach a system of truths which won't any longer alter. We'll reach a system which is immutable, which is absolute. And this system of ultimate truths, the Hegelians called the absolute with a capital A. So their view was that truth is ultimately absolute. And we simply progressively approach it. Our truths get closer and closer to it, and thus get better and better, truer and truer, until one day we reach it at infinity. That was the Hegelian view. Now again we can pick up the pragmatists at this point. A number of them, for instance Dewey, were Hegelians early in their life. They accepted this coherence theory of truth, but at a certain point a thought dawned on them. And it was this. They said simply, well, what use is the absolute? Well, the absolute with the capital A that we're supposed to reach at infinity. By the Hegelians' own statement, the absolute is beyond our grasp now. We don't get to it till infinity. It can't be used, therefore, as a measuring rod for our human truth because it's unknowable to us now. All we have now is our system of finite, relative, constantly changing human truth. Let us, said the pragmatists, then simply get rid of the absolute. Let's just drop the idea. Let's say we agree with the Hegelians, the true idea will be a coherent one, and that we'll accept a coherent idea as true, but not on the grounds that thereby we get closer and closer to the absolute, but rather because Coherent ideas work. That's the key word. Coherent ideas work. They make our world orderly, consistent, intelligible. They are convenient. In other words, again, the criterion of truth will now be the ideal works. It produces desirable consequences. And we will accept coherence as a significant factor in what works. But we will accept coherence not as an end in itself or because it gets us closer to some ultimate absolute, but simply because of its practical value. And thus, again, from another root, we reach the idea that truth is that which works. It's like Hegelianism without the absolute at the end of the road. And now finally, if pragmatism can be regarded as Descartes without the cogito, without the basis for certainty, or Hegel without the absolute, it's also, and even more importantly than either of these two, Kant without the noumenal world. It's Kant without the noumenal world. Now let's take a look at this line of development. You recall, I emphasize this for all it's worth, Kant had said that reality in itself, the noumenal realm, is unknowable. All we can know is a mind-processed world, the world as our mental processing apparatus produces it, the world of phenomena, as he called it, which is a product of our categorial apparatus, our innate interpreting devices operating on the data we get from reality. So what Kant laid down as the crucial point, here again I'm just reminding you of what we've established, is that the world we know is a world we create. That mental processing by human beings is necessary to make a world, to actually create a world. And of course Kant is therefore the real destroyer of the correspondence theory of truth. You could no longer, after Kant, say truth is an issue of correspondence between an idea and reality if reality in itself is unknowable. Kant, in introducing what he called his Copernican revolution, what we call the primacy of consciousness, completely reversed the order of priority and said that the human mind creates the world we experience by processing the raw data. Now the pragmatists agree with this point in full. They agree that the world we know is a world we create, that our mental processing, our mental interpretation, our mental conceptual apparatus creates the world we actually know and deal with. But they disagree with Kant on one point. They, like Hegel, abandon the noumenal world. The noumenal world, as you know, of course, was unknowable, and that's out for the pragmatists. It was inconceivable, and of course the pragmatists pride themselves on being empiricists, and the noumenal world is not open to experience, and therefore on all those grounds they simply throw it out. This involves them, therefore, in a certain alteration in the Kantian position. If you recall the Kantian view, he had said that we had certain categories inbuilt in our minds at birth. That those categories were unavoidable, possessed by all human beings, and they actually derive from the noumenal structure of the mind. That we had no choice whatever, therefore, about the categories and forms of perception that we had. Those were thrust upon us by the unknowable noumenal structure of the mind in itself, and were the same for everybody. But if you don't believe in a noumenal world, then you have thrown out the basis for this inexorable system of categories. You no longer have a metaphysical basis for a rigid set of categories which are foisted on us. And since the pragmatists throw out the noumenal world, since they don't subscribe to it, they don't then believe that the categorial apparatus that we use is inexorably necessitated by some force beyond our control. Well, that then raises for the pragmatists a question. Where do the categories that we use to process and create the world come from? Or putting it another way, why do our minds construct the world that they do? It's not that there's noumenal conditions necessitating a particular set of categories, why then does our mind hold the basic axioms, ideas, concepts, and so on that it does? Now you might say, well, it gets them by derivation from its observations of reality. But if you would say that, you would have forgotten altogether Hume and Kant. Hume and Kant claimed to establish that the crucial concepts and ideas we need to make sense of the world cannot be arrived at on the basis of experience. These crucial concepts must in some sense then be independent of experience, must be a priori, and the pragmatists agree with this. We can't validate or derive our basic concepts from experience. Somehow, they have to come from us, from the nature of the human mind. So the question is, what then is the source of our categories, and how do we judge their validity? Now, to understand the pragmatist answer to this question, I have to remind you that the 19th century was a wild over-evolution. There was the profound Darwinian influence which ran throughout the later 19th century philosophy. We've seen that in several philosophies so far. And it was influential on the pragmatists in their answer to this question. Now we're not here talking about Darwinism as so much as a biological theory, but what philosophers did, because they applied evolution to everything across the board. And we'll see shortly how the pragmatists did that. Prior to Darwin, prior to his disciples' influence, it had been common to say the essence of man is that he is the rational being. That had been Aristotle's definition, for instance. Man is the rational being. But the Darwinists said, no, this is a superficial definition. Man is most fundamentally a member of the class of living organisms. Well, you may say you didn't realize there was an opposition between those two definitions, but you'll see as we go along. The essence of man is that he's a member of the class of living organisms. And therefore, since the theory of evolution will apply to him too, he must engage in a constant struggle for survival. He's part of the evolutionary process, the evolutionary development, and we know that one of the laws of that process is that traits which enhance a species' ability to survive endure, and traits which detract from it, or which are less efficacious in terms of adapting the organism to the environment, are simply weeded out. Well, let's apply that same view to man's mind or intellect. It, after all, has developed in the evolutionary struggle. It has endured. What then must it be if we take an evolutionary interpretation of it? Well, the mind must be a development in the evolutionary struggle. What conclusion can we then come to about it? Well, its goal is not to contemplate, not simply to attain abstract truth for intellectual satisfaction, not simply to be, as the pragmatists say, a spectator, and that in their terms is a pejorative term, a term of reproach. If you view the mind as a faculty simply to gaze out at reality and discover what's there, that's called the spectator model of the mind, and that's out. The mind's goal is not to study reality, but to enable us to survive, to enable us to achieve success in dealing with the environment. The mind is an instrument or tool evolved in man's struggle to survive. Now the pragmatists took over this lead. The result was they abandoned Kant's rigid set of 12 categories and 2 forms of sense, sensibility, etc. They still agree with Kant that some conceptual categorical apparatus creates and processes the world that we experience. But they explained where the particular set of concepts that we use comes from, not in terms of the noumenal world, but in terms of the process of evolution. The process of evolution. The concepts we use to interpret the world have also developed via the evolutionary struggle. And the ones that have lasted because they have worked up to now. So in a word, You can say that pragmatism here simply is Kantianism with the evolutionary process taking the place of Kant's noumenal world as the source of man's categories. And the result is, of course, that we now have a choice as to which particular categories we're going to use. Our categories, our mental processing apparatus develops, it changes, it evolves across time. And we can put it to the test at any given time and see, does this particular way of interpreting the world work or not? And if it does, we'll keep it as long as it works. And if it doesn't, we'll throw it out and try something else. If one set of categories doesn't work, we replace it with another. Our principle will be trial and error. So we've got an option here. It's like Kant, in effect, with an element of choice introduced. You can say, summarize the situation like this. Kant said, the mind gives you certain categories, and the pragmatist's answer is, well, what the mind giveth, the mind can take it away, you see. So it's Kant with option, with choice, with many alternatives. And we can try out a given set and see at any given time which works. And that will then be the true set at that time. If you want it explained in terms of the, remember the eyeglass metaphor that we used with Kant? He wanted to account for a stable world in terms of blue spectacles, which he thought were taped to our nose. Of course, he didn't literally think that that's a metaphor, but in terms of that metaphor. Well, in terms of that metaphor, you can say the pragmatist opened an oculus shop. They got a whole bunch of different types of eyeglasses. And you try one set, and if you don't find that it works to look through that set, here's another set, and so on. So that the pragmatists are advocates, of course, of the primacy of consciousness completely. It's concepts of consciousness which create the world, but with an element of choice added. And if we use the technical term voluntarism that we introduced a week or two ago, meaning emphasis upon the role of the will, we can say then that the pragmatists are like voluntarized Kantians. All right, we've reached the general conclusion of pragmatism. And let's now sketch in positively the essentials of the pragmatist approach to thought and truth, in terms broad enough to cover all of them. Now, I'm just presenting tonight, I'm not criticizing, so you just decide on your own as I go along how many false alternatives you can spot. The first crucial thing to say in summarizing the pragmatist approach is thought is through and through a practical function. A practical function, and by that we mean practical as a distinct from, as opposed to theoretical. Its function, the function of thought, is not to discover what's out there, but to change what's out there. Not to mirror or picture or conform to or correspond with some external objective reality. Because, of course, if you took that view, then you're back in the problem of Descartes, you can't know anything for certain, and the problem of Kant, how can you ever know reality, etc. No, the function of thought for the pragmatist is not to mirror or describe or discover the nature of an external reality, but rather to guide human actions in specific, concrete, practical situations. Thought is a type of adaptive mechanism, an instrument of behavior. So an idea for a pragmatist is not an identification of some fact of reality. An idea is a tool, or as Dewey is very commonly calls it, an instrument. And that's the name of Dewey's version of pragmatism, is instrumentalism, from the idea that ideas are instruments, practical instruments telling us how to behave. The process of thinking for the pragmatist is like this. In the normal case, they say, we go along. Now, I'm presenting this theory straight now. This is not parody, what I'm about to do. In the normal case, we go along simply by routine, by instinct, by habit, meeting situations, by whatever mechanisms we've already habituated, and this is fine, say the pragmatists. In these cases, we don't need to think. We don't need to use our intelligence. Okay. But at a certain point, we get into difficulties. Our routine, our habits, our instinctive methods of functioning don't succeed. They don't work any longer. We're suddenly confronted with a situation in which we don't know what to do. We're confused. We're bewildered. We feel tense. We feel blocked. We feel frustrated. We feel suffused with doubt. You get the idea. Now it's at that point, and at that point only, that we begin to think. Thinking, I believe it was Dewey who said this, but I never could run it down. One famous pragmatist, I think Dewey, said thinking in the most literal sense is a dis-ease. A dis-ease. You resort to thought only when your normal, habitual, unthinking pattern is upset and you feel tense and ill at ease, and then you try to think, you see. So you have to be non-at ease in order to think, and thus the aphorism, thinking is a disease. And of course, what is the goal of our thinking? Well, it's not to know some outside external reality. We've dispensed with that viewpoint. But rather simply remove the uneasiness. Settle the doubt. Produce some plan of action that'll tell you what to do here and now in this situation. So the goal and purpose of thought is to escape from the trouble and the doubts that were caused by this perplexing situation. And here's a direct quote from Peirce on this point. Quote, "With the doubt, therefore, the struggle begins, and with the cessation of doubt, it ends. Hence, the sole object of inquiry is the settlement of opinion." Now get these next few sentences. "We may fancy that this is not enough for us, and that we seek not merely an opinion, but a true opinion. But put this fancy to the test, and it proves groundless. For as soon as a firm belief is reached, we are entirely satisfied whether the belief be true or false." Unquote. In other words, our goal in thinking is simply resolve the conflict that started it, remove the tension, get back to a state of equilibrium, and we're not concerned with such metaphysical questions as does this idea really correspond to some reality. We've dispensed with that viewpoint. Therefore, the fundamental question of any thought process is not what are things like. It's not what is it. That's not the basic question of the thought process. The basic question, the paradigmatic, archetypical question of any thought process for the pragmatist is, what should I do in this perplexing situation? Now, and that's all the mind can ask. That's its basic nature, to ask what to do now. In response to this question, the mind goes through a certain process and ends up with a certain plan of action, telling you what to do. And that's the pragmatist definition of an idea. An idea is a plan of action, telling you how to achieve your practical goals. The plan of action, the idea you come up with, will tell you in pattern, if you do so and so, this will be the consequence. If you do such and such, that will be the consequences. In other words, we just simply have a plan telling us what to do. If we then act on the plan, and it works when we act on it, if the results that it predicts come to pass, then the plan worked. And that means the idea is true. If the plan didn't work, the things that made us expect didn't come true, then we say it's false. So a true idea is simply one which works, one which brings about successful consequences when we act upon it. And as James puts it in a famous line, quote, "The true, to put it very briefly, is only the expedient in the way of our thinking." And he goes on, just as the right, that's what we're going to look at next week, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving, unquote. Now, the clearest example I've ever heard of that is from a hostile commentator. It was from Professor Blanchard in a book called The Nature of Thought, but he makes really very clear what the pragmatist model of thinking is like, and so I want to take a moment to read you this passage from him. Now, he is not a sympathetic commentator. Perhaps that's why it's so clear, but I'll give you this quote because it will help you keep it in mind. Quote, I am walking across a field as darkness comes on. I am aware of my surroundings, but not engaged in what would commonly be called reflection. Suddenly, a dim shape looms up before me and brings me to an uneasy halt. See, I am uncertain of what it is and do not know whether to proceed or to draw back. This, says the pragmatist, is typical of the way every problem arises. It grows out of a situation in which activity is blocked. Now a number of hypotheses dart into my mind. Is the thing a stump, a rock, a bull? These hypotheses are ideas. But what exactly are ideas? The pragmatist's answer gives the essence of his theory of thought. Ideas, he says, are plans of action. My real interest when I think stump is not in a theoretical identification of something as a member of the vegetable kingdom, but my interest is getting safely by. On the other hand, the judgment that is a bull is essentially a suggestion that I draw back or take to my heels. See, I'm not out to give some abstract identification of what things are really are. That is a bull, this is me speaking now, is a shorthand way of saying be careful. That's a plan of action. Don't go in that direction. Continuing with Professor Blanchard, suppose that in fact I judge that as a stump, and in accordance with this plan of action proceed on my way. If the adoption of this plan takes me prosperously to the other side of the field, the judgment is verified and true, since that is the end for which thought was invoked. On the other hand, if there comes a snorting and pounding behind me, and I am forthwith hoist by my own temerity, the plan has not worked. The judgment is erroneous. This simple case may be taken as a paradigm for thinking generally. Unquote. Now you have to take this straight. The whole trick in getting pragmatism is that they mean it. You must not interpret this to mean that a pragmatist is simply saying there is a bull in reality, and therefore it works to believe that there's one, if, let us say, there is one. Anyone could say that. You don't have to be a pragmatist to say if something is true in the sense of it corresponds to reality, it will work to act on that particular hypothesis. What the pragmatists are saying is that the working of an idea is what constitutes its truth. That's the very meaning of truth. It's not that it works as a result of the fact that it's true by another criterion, namely it corresponds to reality, but that the fact of it working, of achieving our ends, is all that it means to say an idea is true. An idea is true simply is this idea, this plan of action guided me successfully through this particular circumstance. In other words, the whole metaphysics of consciousness and existence has been swept aside. Thought has been reconstrued as a practical adaptive mechanism whose nature is to produce plans of action to get us out of difficulties. And truth is any process of thought which is successful in getting us out of the difficulty at the time. Whichever way of conceptually organizing our experiences is most practical is what we literally mean by truth. So if you want to put it this way, I sometimes put it this way, the true for pragmatism is a species of the good, namely that which it is good to believe, that which produces desirable consequences. And this, of course, I may mention parenthetically, is the exact opposite of the objectivist view. For the objectivist view, the true is the recognition of reality, and the good is simply one aspect or type or species of the true, namely that which is in accord with reality. But the pragmatist view is entirely in reverse. Now, since this pragmatist concept of truth is so crucial, I want, before the break, to read you a passage from William James, from his work entitled What Pragmatism Means. It's a fairly extended passage, but it will give you the flavor and the idea and the statement from him as clearly as one can put it. And notice, you will see a strong coherence element running throughout this quotation of an idea being true insofar as it fits into the rest of our ideas. I've already indicated the way in which the pragmatists borrow that element from the coherence theory. Now here I'm going to quote from James. Quote, "The process is always the same. The individual has a stock of old opinions already, but he meets a new experience that puts them to a strain. Somebody contradicts them, or in a reflective moment he discovers that they contradict each other, or he hears of facts with which they are incompatible, or desires arise in him which they cease to satisfy." All those put together. "The result is an inward trouble to which his mind till then had been a stranger, and from which he seeks to escape by modifying his previous mass of opinions. He saves as much of it as he can, for in this matter of belief we are all extreme conservatives. So he tries to change first this opinion and then that, for they resist change very variously, until at last some new idea comes up which he can graft upon his old stock with a minimum of disturbance of the latter. Some idea that mediates between the stock and the new experience and runs them into one another most felicitously and expediently. This new idea is then adopted as the true one. It preserves the older stock of truth with a minimum of modification, stretching them just enough to make them admit the novelty, but conceiving them in ways as familiar as the case leaves possible. New truth is always a go-between, a smoother over of transitions. It marries old opinion to new fact so as ever to show a minimum of jolt, a maximum of continuity. We hold a theory true just in proportion to its success in solving this problem." And then he gives this example. He says, "Often the day's contents oblige a rearrangement. If I should now utter piercing shrieks and act like a maniac on this platform, it would make many of you revise your ideas as to the probable worth of my philosophy." See, if you have a problem, you need a new plan of action. Radium came the other day. That's a typical way for a pragmatist to formulate something. He was minding his own business, and now radium came, so he's got a new problem. Radium came the other day as part of the day's content and seemed for a moment to contradict our ideas of the whole order of nature, that order having come to be identified with what is called the conservation of energy. And then James goes on, however, that someone found a way to save traditional views of energy as much as they could while accommodating radium. And he goes on, "I need not multiply instances. A new opinion counts as true just in proportion as it gratifies the individual's desire to assimilate the novel in his experience to his beliefs in stock." Now, Dewey and Schiller proceed to generalize this observation and to apply it to the most ancient parts of truth. They also once were plastic. They also were called true for human reasons. They also mediated between still earlier truths and what in those days were novel observations. Purely objective truth, truth in whose establishment the function of giving human satisfaction in marrying previous parts of experience with newer parts played no role whatever, such truth is nowhere to be found. The reason why we call things true is the reason why they are true, for to be true means only to perform this marriage function. Unquote. Now that's pretty clear. Truth is the ability of an idea to subserve human purposes. Now you can see some obvious consequences of this view of truth. To begin with, one clear-cut mark of a pragmatist is that he will deny in answer to any question that there is any such thing as the truth in the answer to that question. There will be no such thing as saying, this is the real truth. This is the way things really are.
Truth is inherently subjective for the pragmatist, or human, as they like to call it. Truth is that which serves our needs. It's a function of our knowledge, our goals, our purposes, our problems. There's no such thing as one right answer to any question. All there is an answer which works okay for us now. What you say, but surely on some things there's an answer which is the truth, to which they say, if you think of something as the truth, the chances are that also is a pragmatist truth, but it's an old one that's been around for so long that you forgot the pragmatist process that generated. James would put it, what people think of as the truth is simply a truth petrified by years of pragmatic service, and people have forgotten where it originally came from. I'll quote you from James on this point. The trail of the human serpent is thus over everything. This is in quotes. Truth independent, truth that we find merely, truth no longer malleable to human need. Get that? Truth no longer malleable to human need. Such truth means only the dead heart of the living tree. And its being there means only that truth also has its paleontology and its prescription, and may grow stiff with years of veteran service and petrified in men's regard by sheer antiquity. Unquote. So there's no such thing as the truth. There's only pragmatic truths that have been around for a long time, and whose pragmatic origin many people have forgotten, but they still are only true on pragmatic ground. Another obvious consequence is there are no absolutes on this view. There's no such thing as absolute truth. What works today need not work tomorrow. Truth, say the pragmatist, is mutable. It's flexible. It's pliant. And they frequently add it's a matter of degree. Something can work to a certain extent and not to another extent. Well, it's true to a certain degree and then not to another degree. And they very much like to illustrate this viewpoint that all truth is relative, that there are no absolute truths, by reference to the development of science. A common example, for instance, is they will point out the development from the Ptolemaic geocentric view of the Earth at the center to the Copernican view with the sun at the center. And they will say each of these worked in its time. The Ptolemaic view worked in its day, and therefore it was actually true at that time. Why did Copernicus, why was his theory accepted? Why did it supersede the Ptolemaic view? Well, because it worked better at that stage in human development. It gave us a more coherent world. It gave us a simpler intellectual account. It had more predictive power. It was a more convenient theory. Can we say that the Ptolemaic view was really wrong and that the Earth is really not at the center of the solar system? No. Who knows? We cannot ask such questions. All we can say is, on the basis of the data we have now, the Copernican theory works better than the Ptolemaic theory. And therefore now, for us, the Ptolemaic theory is no longer true pragmatically, although it was a true theory in the medieval period when it was accepted. When you say a theory is true, you mean it worked. Now you might ask, why wouldn't past truths, once established, always work? Why is there this constant change that the pragmatists allow for? And there are three main points here. One is that because they are skeptics, they hold you can never be certain of anything. You never know when some new experience will arrive which will cause you to upset your old view, and you'll have to find a new hypothesis to work. That's one type of reason why they insist that there are no absolutes. A second is derived from Hume. They are strong believers in the fact that everything is contingent, everything is simply a brute fact, There are no necessities in the world, and therefore anything is possible. How do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? And I might mention, thirdly, that there is a large dose of Heraclitus in the pragmatists. Remember, nothing is, everything is becoming. So you couldn't claim on that grounds either that you found an eternal law. Everything is flux. You can't step in the same law twice, so to speak, because everything is constantly changing. So we reach the conclusion that there are no absolute truths. Truth is simply that which works for us at a given time to a particular extent. With that, let's take our break and then pick. Now, if you have been following me up to this point, you will undoubtedly have a very strong sense that everything I have been saying is in reverse, and that the pragmatists have everything backwards. You'll probably feel, in spite of what I've tried to make clear as the pragmatist view, that it's true that a true idea will work in practice, but that's because it corresponds to facts. If I say, for instance, there is a cup of water on this table, and I say it's true, and therefore it works because it's true, that's perfectly understandable. On the other hand, if I say there is an elephant on this table and it doesn't work, you'd say obviously the reason is because that's not the way the facts are, there is no elephant. In other words, your view would be that there's a world of definite facts which exist and that therefore some ideas work and others don't. Now you must understand that the pragmatists take exactly the reverse position. It's not that something works because it's a fact, but that something is a fact because it works. Let me repeat that. It's not that something works because it's a fact, but that it's a fact because it works. Now, what does a pragmatist mean by calling something a fact? We can still use the term, they say, but we must give it a pragmatist interpretation. We have to dispense with the idea that a fact is something out there in a reality, independent of us, that we're trying to know. That's the old spectator view. That's the correspondence view that's been discredited. We live in a world created by our consciousness's conceptualizing activities. Well, what then could a fact be on this type of philosophy? Well, the pragmatist answer is this. A fact is that interpretation or hypothesis which a consciousness places on the stream of sensations, that interpretation which is practically satisfying, in which we don't now see any need to doubt or change. In other words, whatever interpretation works and does not give us now any pause, any reason to doubt it or question it, qualifies as a fact. A fact is a human creation. If you want to put it for short, for the pragmatist, a fact is simply a human theory that works without doubt for the present time. A fact is what we don't now doubt. And here's a quote from Peirce, defining when we can consider something a demonstration. He uses the term demonstration rather than fact, but you'll see that the same idea is there. Quote, "It is a very common idea that a demonstration must rest on some ultimate and absolutely indubitable propositions. These, according to one school, are first principles of a general nature. According to another, are sensations. But in point of fact, an inquiry, to have that completely satisfactory result called demonstration, has only to start with propositions perfectly free from all actual doubt. If the premises are not, in fact, doubted at all, they cannot be more satisfactory than they are." I'll repeat that last line. If the premises are not, in fact, doubted at all, they cannot be more satisfactory than they are. Unquote. Now, of course, we must immediately add that anything that we don't doubt now, we can in principle doubt at some point in the future, because there are no absolutes. So that we have to distinguish, as one of my professors in a course on pragmatism put it, He said it's very important for pragmatists to distinguish between the doubtful and the dubitable. The doubtful and the dubitable. The doubtful is something that somebody actually doubts. Somebody is actually in a quandary about it. He's going around saying, I don't know whether it's so or not. The dubitable is something which can be doubted, even though nobody is actually doubting it now at any particular given time. It's capable of being doubted, but it's not actually being doubted. Now, as this professor put it, the pragmatist view is everything is dubitable, but some things aren't doubtful. Everything is capable of being doubted at some point, but some things is just not pragmatic to actually doubt at a given point, and therefore those things are not doubtful and qualify as facts at that time. Now, I couldn't resist raising the question to him, by what standard does a pragmatist decide when to convert something from the dubitable to the doubtful? If every idea is inherently dubitable and capable of being doubted, how do you know when you should actually start doing the doubting and make it doubtful so that it's no longer a fact? I report without further comment that the answer I got was, don't be a skeptic. You can't doubt everything, he said. Sufficient unto the day is the problems thereof. Let's be practical. Well, let's continue. If a fact is something constructed by man, you may very well ask, what about areas of the world that man has not yet investigated or inquired into? What about areas that he has no hypotheses about? Areas he has no satisfactory interpretation of yet. In other words, areas that he hasn't yet made into facts. You may very well ask, wouldn't the pragmatist view that man creates facts by his thinking processes, wouldn't that imply that any area that we have not yet inquired into and engaged in this process of creating facts, that area is then nothing in particular, that it has no identity, that it is, in the technical term, indeterminate. And indeterminate means thing which is nothing in particular. You may ask me, is the pragmatist view then that what we call reality, that it's actually indeterminate prior to human beings coming in and constructing facts in that area? And the answer to that question is yes. That is the pragmatist view. I'll give you a quote from John Dewey. This is his famous definition of inquiry. It's a large mouthful, and I will not try to dictate it to you, but I think you'll get the idea from it. Quote, this is his definition of what the process of inquiry is. Quote, the controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is so determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations as to convert the elements of the original situation into a unified whole, unquote. In other words, in the process of inquiry, we begin with an indeterminate situation, a situation which in itself has no particular identity, is nothing in particular, and in the process of inquiring, we create a determinate character and nature out there where previously there was none. Inquiry is not a process of discovery, not a process of identifying facts which existed antecedently to man and independently of him. Inquiry for the pragmatist is a process of transforming the indeterminate into something determinate. It's a process of creating identity where earlier there was none. Human investigation is what confers identity upon existence. And I think the blatant primacy of consciousness of this view speaks for itself. Now, this is not just implied in Dewey. He's very explicit on this point. The situation prior to our inquiry, he says, is really indeterminate. That doesn't just mean that we don't know in advance of investigation what things are, but that in fact things are nothing in particular. They are indeterminate until we come along and impress an identity upon them. And I quote from Dewey, A variety of names serves to characterize indeterminate situations. They are disturbed, troubled, ambiguous, confused, full of conflicting tendencies, obscure, etc. It is the situation, he has that word italicized, it is the situation that has these traits. We are doubtful because the situation is inherently doubtful. The habit of disposing of the doubtful as if it belonged only to us rather than to the existential situation must be rejected, unquote. In other words, doubt is not just an attribute of human beings who lack knowledge. Reality in itself is inherently doubtful, indeterminate, nothing particular until we come along and create an identity. Here's another quote from Dewey, quote, "The notion that in actual existence everything is completely determinate has been rendered questionable by the progress of physical science itself," unquote. And here's one more, a brief one which you can ponder. Quote from Dewey, "The world is constructed by experiment," unquote. Well, that's a nice summary of this point. So much for your idea that it's facts determine what works. Or exact reverse, you see, for the pragmatist is true. What works determines what's a fact. Now I see you looking exasperated. And you probably want to ask at this point, don't you have to draw a clear line between thoughts and things, between consciousness and existence? I can see the question on many people's lips. Namely, doubt can characterize a human mind when it doesn't know something, but how can it characterize the actual world? How can it characterize existence? Now you should know what the pragmatist answer to that would be. In your very posing of that question, you are making a subject-object distinction. You're trying to draw a firm line between consciousness and existence, mind and physical things, subject and object. And you should know by now that that distinction is passé, old-fashioned, hated, despised, out. You still, you see, are thinking that there's a world of things and an inner world of consciousness, and that the function of consciousness is to look out and grasp the nature of the outside world. And that, of course, is all wrong according to the pragmatist. Well, you may ask then, what does exist according to the pragmatist? If it isn't mind and matter, consciousness and existence, subject and object, what does exist? Well, here the pragmatists have an answer. They are empiricists, remember. And they can only know what they experience. And all they experience, they report, is experience. And consequently, they say, that's all that exists. That's the stuff of the universe. The entire universe is made up out of experience, a flow of experiences. This viewpoint is sometimes called radical empiricism. Radical empiricism being the view that the world is comprised of experience. It's a flow of experiences, and that's all. William James, who was a radical empiricist, defined experience in this sense as follows. Quote, "The immediate flux of life which furnishes the material to our later reflection." Unquote. That's the best he does as a definition. You mustn't think of experience in this sense as what you get when you look out at the world around you now, because you already have all sorts of conceptual interpretation built into it, so you're not coming in contact with raw experience at this point. James cites two types of case, at least, in which you get direct raw experience, which is the ultimate ingredients of the world. A newborn infant, as the world strikes him, just the flow of sense data, you see, uninterpreted. He gets pure experience, the raw stuff of the world. And James also mentions semi-conscious people, like people in a coma, who get just the direct flow of experience, but without any conceptual interpretation. So, that is the world stuff. That's all. We're dispensing with consciousness versus existence, mind versus matter, thought versus thing. There's just a flow of experience. I quote you from one commentator, quote, "It had commonly been supposed, prior to James, that within knowledge we must be able to distinguish a thinker from a thing thought about." You see why that would be a common supposition. This James now denied. Here is a quote from James. "My thesis is," from James, "my thesis is that if we start with the supposition that there is only one kind of stuff or material, a stuff of which everything is composed, and if we call that stuff pure experience, then knowing can easily be explained as a particular sort of relation towards one another into which portions of pure experience may enter." Commentator goes on, "We do not need to presume either things or consciousness in order to give an account of knowledge." Unquote. Now you say, well, but you mean that he makes no distinction between thought in our minds and something which is really out there in reality? The commentator goes on, quote, "If we discriminate some of our experiences as existing only in the mind and call others real or objective, this, James suggests, is only because they stand in different relationships to our other experiences." Here's a quote from James. "Mental fire," get this, "mental fire is what won't burn real sticks. Mental knives may be sharp, but they won't cut real wood. With real objects, on the contrary, consequences always accrue, and thus the real experiences get sifted from the mental ones, the things from our thoughts of them, and precipitated together as the stable part of the whole experience chaos under the name of the physical world." Unquote. Let me elucidate that because you look slightly puzzled. You have a tense image of a fire, mental image as you would call it. Like a dream, for instance, or a hallucination, or a very vivid mental image, and you can, in your mind's eye, see the crackling flames and hear the crackling and so on. But it's what we call mental. Now we contrast that to what we call a real fire, the actual tongues leaping and the flickering and the orange color, etc. Now you would say, well, one fire is really out there and the other is just an image in your mind. According to James, this is entirely incorrect. Both of these fires have the same metaphysical status. They are both made of experience, that's all. They're both simply sets of experience. And it's not true that one is really out there and one is really in here. That's all out. That happens to be, however, a difference between these experiences. One set of experiences, let's say, well-behaved. When we take the set of experiences we call wood and put it in the set of experiences that we call a real fire, we find that the wood starts to burn. When, however, we take the set of experiences we call wood and try to do something with it with the set of experiences that we call the mental fire, nothing happens to the wood. See, so the experiences have different relationships. Some fall into a coherent pattern, and some are crazy mixed up experiences like the one in the mental case where it doesn't do anything. See? And so we simply segregate out the wild experiences that don't fit into the rest and call those mental. We give them some term like hallucination, image, dream, etc. And by that means we take the flow of experience and we divide it up into two kinds. The well-behaved, orderly type that follow certain patterns we call physical. And the wild, crazy ones we call mental. And that is the source of the idea that there's a distinction between the mental and the physical. But actually, in reality, there's only an undifferentiated flux of experience, what we call thoughts and things. That distinction is simply a human construct, a way of organizing and classifying the data of reality that goes by. All there really is a procession of experiences. That's the basic category. Matter and mind are simply our ways of making experience dealable with. They're our creations. If you ask me, well, in itself, is experience mental or physical? The answer is it's neither. In itself, it's just experience. Physical and mental are names we give it when we try to organize it into categories. So if you try to appeal to the subject-object distinction, to invalidate pragmatism, you see they say there is no such distinction metaphysically. All right, let's go on to another aspect of pragmatism. Their view of concepts. Now, as you would expect, the pragmatists are nominalists, arch-nominalists. I may say Peirce was a mixed case, but the others are all arch-nominalists. They do not believe that concepts are dictated by reality. There's no real objective basis for our concepts, our classifications. There's no such thing, according to them, as the objective essence of an existent or a class. Concepts are merely convenient ways of organizing our perceptual data. And of course, we have options in our classification, in our conceptual schemes, and how do we decide? By pragmatic criteria. If a certain form of conceptual organization works for our purposes at the time, it's valid. It's pragmatic. Now, for instance, I look at this, I point to this, and I ask you, what is the essence of this? You immediately say to me, it's a piece of paper, right? You think that's all clear-cut? That's essentially what it is. Well, is its essence a piece of paper according to pragmatism? Well, remember, there's no such thing as what a thing is essentially. Essence is a human creation. So its essence can be whatever you want to interpret it as, whatever is pragmatic. Dewey, talking about a piece of paper, says, yeah, it's a piece of paper, but also, quote, talking about a piece of paper now, quote from Dewey, it signifies something to start a fire with. I'll stop at the semicolons. Any one of these you see is an alternative statement of what is essential. It signifies something to start a fire with, something like snow, made of wood pulp, manufactured for profit, property in the legal sense, a definite combination illustrative of certain principles of chemical science, an article the invention of which has made a tremendous difference in human history, and so on indefinitely. There is no conceivable universe of discourse in which the thing may not figure, having in each its own characteristic meaning. Now you say to me, but after all, it really is a piece of paper, right? And Dewey says, and continuing the quote, and if we say that after all it is paper, which has all these different meanings, we are at bottom but asserting that paper is its ordinary meaning for human intercourse, unquote. This particular commentator elaborates, quote, there is no more reason to say that the essence of this existence is white surface for writing than to say its essence is wood pulp. Any such claim merely reflects the predominant interest which the definer happens to have in the existent in question, unquote. In other words, your classification, your statement of what is and isn't essential is determined by your purposes, your interests, and the classification that works best is the valid one for that time and that purpose. Now that, you see, is a pretty typical type of nominalism pushed in a pragmatist direction. Now you know by now that if you are going to be a nominalist, you're going to be a sensualist. You're going to hold a man is restricted in his cognitive capacity to what is directly accessible to sense experience. And you know, if you remember our discussion of Comte and particularly of Hume, the opening night, that the nominal essentialist combination leads to a specific theory of meaning. We saw this in Hume, and you should now get to the point of expecting that there's going to be a pragmatist theory of meaning, which is going to be essentially a variant of the Humean theory, but given now a pragmatist or practice-oriented twist. So I want now to turn to that topic, very essential to understanding pragmatism. Title it for your notes, The Pragmatist Theory of Meaning. Now let me just remind you about the issue of meaning. The theory of meaning, as we indicated in our discussion with Hume, is supposed to tell you whether an idea is meaningful or not. And if it is meaningful, what exactly it does mean. Remember that we use the word meaningful here in a very specific sense. An idea is meaningful if it says something, if it communicates something, if it has some cognitive content. The opposite of a meaningful idea is not an unimportant one or a trivial one, but nonsense, gibberish. If I say ish to triddle to doodle, that is meaningless. Anything else, true or false, that communicates some content is meaningful. And so a theory of meaning is supposed to tell you, is a given string of words meaningful or not? And then if it is meaningful, what does it mean? This issue of meaning became a major issue in Hume, as we saw, and it was picked up in the 20th century and became a major issue in philosophy in the first half of this century. The pragmatists have their theory of meaning, which we're going to go into now, and the positivists next week have a variant, sort of a blood brother of it, both of them derivatives of Hume's, and the majority of their central conclusions derive from their theories of meaning, so we must look at this issue. Now, in a general way, any philosopher answers the question about meaning in terms of his view of the nature and function of the human mind and of ideas. So if I were, for instance, to give you a very simplified idea of an Aristotelian theory of meaning, it would be something like this. The function of the mind is to be aware of reality. An idea on this view is an identification of reality. And on this view, an idea is then meaningful if it refers to reality and says something about it. It may be false. I may say there's an elephant on this table when there isn't, but it's meaningful because I claim to make some reference to reality and at least claim to describe the way things actually are. And what my statement, whether true or false, means on this Aristotelian view is what it says about reality. But now, obviously, a pragmatist cannot have any theory of meaning remotely like this. The function of the mind for him is not to describe or discover the nature of reality, but to produce plans of action. Remember, I stressed that point. The function of the mind is to tell us what to do in the face of practical difficulties, what to expect in the future, and how to guide our actions accordingly. An idea, remember, is a plan of action, a tool, an instrument. Well, then, what would make an idea meaningful on this interpretation of what is the function and nature of an idea? Well, a meaningful idea would have to be one which does claim to guide action. An idea which tells us what to expect of the future. An idea which makes some prediction relevant to our future behavior. An idea, in other words, which successfully which functions as a plan guiding our actions. If an idea fulfills this criterion for the pragmatist, it's meaningful. And what will be its meaning? Well, the practical consequences that it predicts in the future. The meaning of an idea for a pragmatist is always expressible in terms of hypothetical propositions. It'll always be of this form. If you do so and so, then expect this result. If you do such and such, then expect that result, and so on. We'll take any idea and simply ask, does it lead to any practical consequences? Does it tell us what to expect of the future? Does it claim to guide our action? If the answer is no, then the idea is just noise. If the answer is yes, then it's meaningful, and its meaning is the concrete practical guidance that we can generate from it. Now, this approach to the theory of meaning was originated by Peirce, and it was the actual historical genesis of pragmatism. And I will read you Peirce's statement of it. It's got unfortunately a number of the uses of the same word, so it's a little hard to follow, but it's fairly short and a very famous statement. Quote, "Consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object." Unquote. Did I say that one more time? Consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object, unquote. In other words, you're thinking of something. You have some idea. Well, Peirce's advice is, ask yourself, what practical consequences can you expect as a result of this idea? And whatever those practical consequences are, that is the totality of the meaning of the original idea. The idea means the practical consequences. James took that over from Peirce, and he summarized it as follows, quote, "To attain perfect clearness in our thoughts of an object, then, we need only consider what conceivable effects of a practical kind the object may involve, what sensations we are to expect from it, and what reactions we must prepare. Our conception of these effects, whether immediate or remote, is then for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all." Unquote. In other words, you're given some concept, some idea, some theory. You ask, if you're a pragmatist, you ask yourself, what difference would this theory make to my future if it were true? What experiences, what sensations does it predict that I'm going to encounter? What sensations does it tell me are lurking in the future, awaiting me, that a rival theory wouldn't? What difference, in other words, in my sensations in the future do I expect on its basis? How would I act differently if I accept this theory rather than some other? Now, this is what's called the practical consequence. Very often called the cash value of the theory by practice. The cash value means the practical consequence, the sensations that predict the actions you should take on its basis. And the cash value is the actual meaning of the theory. The theory means the practical consequences of it. Needless to say, then, if a theory yields no practical consequences, if you wouldn't act differently, whether it were true or not, if it makes no predictions about future sensations, then, of course, it's not a plan of action, and that means it is just gibberish. Now, notice again that just as on the question of truth, so on the question of meaning. The pragmatists are not saying an idea is meaningful in the sense of having a relationship to reality and therefore has certain practical consequences. They are saying its meaning is the sum of its practical consequences. Now, how would you apply this theory? Well, let's take a simple application first and then some trickier one. Suppose I point to somebody and say, that man is 6 feet tall. Is that meaningful on a pragmatist theory of meaning? And the answer is yes, because that makes predictions. Believe it or not, that's a plan of action, because it tells me what to expect if I take certain actions. For instance, it tells me if I stand that man up against the wall, it'll block out a large area. See? Tells me if I take, say, a 4-foot coffin and try and stuff him in, he won't fit, etc. Now, you can make up the rest, you see, but there's an awful lot of consequences that it predicts of future experience. That totality of future predictions that it makes are the sensations we expect on the basis of it. And consequently, this theory, a man is 6 feet tall, makes a difference. It has a cash value in guiding human life. It's therefore meaningful. And the sum of all those future predictions are what it means. See? That is the meaning. Now, if you get the hang of this, let us try and apply this theory of meaning to a number of major philosophic questions. Now, among other things, the pragmatists used this theory of meaning in order to resolve metaphysical, philosophical disputes that had gone on for centuries and millennia, and had avid partisans, and the partisans could never come to a resolution of the problem that satisfied them all. And the pragmatist's method of solving the problem was simply to say the whole dispute is misplaced, it is entirely empty of any content. They did this on a great many. Let's take a few and see how, if you apply the pragmatist theory of meaning, you get rid of one problem after the other, so they say. Take, for instance, a typical metaphysical dispute on the constitution of reality. Now, traditionally, for instance, there have been three main camps. On the one hand, there were the idealists, a la Hegel, for instance, who said that everything is ultimately mind. Then there were the materialists, who said, as like Marx, for instance, who said everything is ultimately matter. And then there were the dualists, who said, no, there's mind and matter, which Descartes would be an example. Now the pragmatist comes on the scene, and he finds these parties all disagreeing with each other vehemently. And he begins to apply his theory of meaning. He says, what's the cash value any one of these three theories? What difference in sensations do they predict? How would I act differently if I accepted one rather than the other two? An idea is a plan of action. These are three ideas, three different theories. Well, what are the different plans of action? And he goes up to the idealist and he says, tell me the predictions you make about the future. I want the cash value of idealism. Do you deny that we hear noises? And of course the idealist says, no, I don't deny that you hear noises. I don't deny that you feel hard shapes, solid textures, and so on. I don't deny any of your actual experiences. I simply say, at root, they really are expressions of a mind. But I don't make any particular, I don't deny any of the sensations you experience. Well, then he goes to the materialists. And he says, do you deny introspective data? Do you deny that men feel love and hate and so on? And a typical materialist will say, no, I grant there's such a thing as love, but if you studied love, you would see that really, ultimately, it's the squirting of glandular juices or whichever. In other words, it's a materialistic phenomenon at root, but I don't deny that in terms of the flow of our experiences, we experience this type of phenomenon. And he goes to the dualist and he asks him, do you deny, do you make any particular predictions that the other two don't? And the dualist says, no. Consequently, the pragmatist said, well, then what's the difference between these three theories? No one of them predicts any one sensation, but the others don't. No one of them is a plan of action telling me to behave in one way rather than another. All of them, therefore, are indistinguishable from each other. The whole problem is entirely a pseudo-problem. There's no pragmatic difference between these positions. There's no cash value to any of them. And consequently, the whole dispute is empty, and all these positions can simply be discarded. Now, if you get this method, you see you can run all the way through the history of philosophy, simply wiping out one topic after the other by saying it has no cash value. I'll give you one more example of resolving, in quotes, a metaphysical dispute. And this one borrowed from William James. He's talking about the dispute between a materialist and a theist in regard to the origin and development of the physical world. And by materialist, take that here as a stand-in for the atheist. Now, on the face of it, you'd say there's certainly a huge difference between a materialist who makes no reference at all to God or the supernatural, and a theist who explains everything by reference to the will of God. The theist says everything that happens in accordance with God's plan, and that's what we need to do to explain. That's what we need to know to explain things. And the materialist says, no, we can understand the whole world strictly in terms of matter and energy and the laws governing it. Now the pragmatist enters the scene. And he says, well, let's hear your concrete predictions. Let's hear the specific plan of action. He says to the materialist, what particular sensations do we expect in the world if your theory of it is true? And he says the same thing to the theist. And neither of them makes any particular concrete sensory prediction that the other doesn't. The theist doesn't deny any of the facts we experience. He simply says it comes from the will of God. The materialist doesn't deny any of the experiences we have. He simply says it comes from the nature of matter. It's not as though, you see, what a pragmatist would like would be if you believed in God and you could generate from that the prediction that in 2 weeks we'd all turn blue. See? Then you'd have cash value, you see, because we could go around and check it by sense experience, but you can't do that. See? And therefore his conclusion is neither of these theories, God or materialism, makes any predictions, neither has any cash value, and consequently, I directly quote from James now, quote, "The pragmatist must consequently say that the two theories, in spite of their different sounding names, mean exactly the same thing, and that the dispute is purely verbal. If no future detail of experience or conduct is to be deduced from either hypothesis, the debate between materialism and theism becomes quite idle and insignificant. Matter and God in that event mean exactly the same thing, and a wise man is he who, in such a case, would turn his back upon such a supererogatory discussion." Unquote. You get the idea and the method by which we simply get rid of philosophic problems. Now, I will say that we're going to return to God in a moment. This is not the whole story, because James has more to say about God, and he's going to come up with some meaning, in his case, for God, for the belief in God shortly. But for now, I use it just as an illustration. The point is, if there's no pragmatic difference in two ideas, then there's no difference in meaning, and any dispute between these two advocates is simply empty and verbal. They're not different plans of action, then they're not different ideas, because an idea is a plan of action, and its meaning is what it predicts about the future and what it tells us in terms of how to act. Now, what happens to the law of cause and effect on this theory of meaning? Out of the proposition, there's a universal law of cause and effect. Every event has a cause. Now you ask yourself, what's the cash value of that? Because what it means is it's cash value. What it means is it's pragmatic consequences. Well, does this statement have consequences? Yes, say the pragmatists. Well, the consequences of this statement that every event has a cause is we can expect our experiences to follow one another in an orderly, uniform fashion. We can expect that given enough knowledge, we'll be able to predict the future on the basis of the past. We can expect that events will fall in regular sequences, definite combinations, that they will be, using Hume's term, repeated conjunction among events. That's the cash value of cause and effect, that events will behave in orderly, uniform ways. Well, if that's the cash value, that is then the meaning of the proposition that every event has a cause. The proposition means its cash value. And therefore, it's not the case that when you say every event has a cause, you mean there is a necessary connection between the nature of an entity and its mode of action. That's not what you mean. See, on the objectivist view, you would mean, when you say every event has a cause, that there's a necessary connection between the nature of an entity and its mode of action, and therefore, as a result of that, there will be order, uniformity, and so on in the world. But on the pragmatist view, the meaning is the consequences of the proposition. And therefore, the law of cause and effect is simply the statement, expect that experiences in the future will behave in orderly ways and act accordingly. Will they behave in orderly ways because there's a law of cause and effect? No. That's the meaning of the law of cause and effect. Well, why will experience behave in orderly ways then, according to the pragmatists? That is simply a brute fact, they say. It comes down to Hume's view. It's a contingent fact that certain sequences follow one another in a uniform, regular fashion. Well, you say, what do the pragmatists do about the future? How do they solve the problem of induction? How are they justified in inducing and generalizing from past experience to future if all they have is the brute fact, certain experiences are uniform, and their answer to the problem of induction is, it works so far, and we'll worry about it when it stops. After all, on this viewpoint, to say that something is true or valid is simply to say it works. And so if induction works, then that's all we need. Remember, it may be dubitable, but it's not now doubtful, and therefore we simply pass on. Suppose you find a realm where you can't find order and regularity, as, for instance, some physicists claim to have found in the realm of subatomic physics, that they can no longer find the kind of uniformity that the older-fashioned physicists found in the macroscopic realm. Well, some pragmatists have said, simply, that means the law of cause and effect has stopped working. Now, it's no longer true. It doesn't work, and we throw it out. Other pragmatists, I may say, are old-fashioned, or more old-fashioned, and they say, let's keep looking, maybe we'll find order. So, it amounts to Hume, but actually we are worse off than we were under Hume on this point, if you can believe that. We're worse off in the following way. Consider the fate of general propositions, or universal propositions, under this theory of meaning. By universal proposition, we mean any proposition of the form all S is P. All such and such is such and such. It would include all universal laws, all scientific principles. Take a simple example. I'll just give you a very simple one. Take the principle that arsenic fed to a living organism in certain doses will kill it. Now, that would be, I use that because I'm going to say it very briefly. I'm going to simply say arsenic kills and let you assume that that means given in the right doses to a certain type of creature. Now, we use this as an example of a universal proposition. And the normal, non-pragmatist person, when he hears the statement arsenic kills, interprets that to mean all cases of arsenic in the right quantity to the right part and so on will be lethal. Namely, all arsenic in the past, all arsenic in the present, and all arsenic yet to come in the future, which is a common sense interpretation of the statement that all arsenic kills. Can a pragmatist interpret that statement this way? Well, no, he can't. To begin with, as a strict pragmatist, he cannot even think of arsenic in the past. Because an idea is a plan of action. An idea is a statement which tells you what to do in the future. It's a statement, if you do so-and-so, then expect such and such. It's always directed to the future. And the meaning of an idea is the predictions it makes about the future. So if you are a strict pragmatist, you cannot think about the past, because the past is no longer within your purview. You no longer need plans of action about the past. It's past. So the most that a pragmatist, a literal pragmatist, could literally think would be all arsenic yet to come is poisonous and will kill you. Now that, you think, is already pretty fatal, because he cannot even conceive the proposition that all arsenic will kill. But he cannot actually even, strictly speaking, think that all arsenic yet to come is poisonous, because it's too broad for a pragmatist. Remember, the meaning of a proposition is the consequences in our experience. And the consequence that we'll never experience, that we'll never encounter, has no effect on our actions, and is therefore, strictly speaking, unthinkable on a pragmatist viewpoint. Consequently, all we can think is all the arsenic we shall ever experience will kill. That's the most you can literally conceive, given the pragmatist theory of meaning. Now you see, we're one step off worse than Hume. Hume could at least conceive the proposition, all arsenic is poisonous, even if by his philosophy he had no method of validating it. But now we cannot, following this theory of meaning, even conceive the proposition, all arsenic is poisonous. The most we can think is, all arsenic we shall experience is poisonous. Well, then it's obviously hopeless to attempt to prove any such generalization. We couldn't hope to understand why arsenic by its nature must kill human beings given the nature of its effects on their bodies and so on, because we can't even conceive that proposition that arsenic as such must do such and such. We're in a worse position even than Hume. The last hope of intelligibility is gone. The idea of law as such is banished by this theory of meaning. We have a Humeanism, you see, gone so far that the alternative is now no longer even conceivable. In a word, a general principle, according to pragmatism, is literally inconceivable. And you see now why pragmatists don't appeal to general principles. They are concrete bound as a matter of general principle. Well, from these few examples, I think you see the kinds of consequences implicit in the pragmatist theory of meaning. I want to go on now, and we will return at a later lecture for some critical comments on this theory of meaning. Up to this point, I have spoken as though all pragmatists pretty much are in agreement with each other. And that is true on the fundamental kinds of points I have made up to now. But you should know that there are, in effect, two different schools of pragmatism. On the one hand, there are the more or less open subjectivists, and that would be best represented by James and Schiller. On the other, the ones that are much more in fashion among those who are pragmatists today, and those are the so-called scientific pragmatists. Namely, they would be best represented by Dewey and Peirce. And the main difference between these schools is they agree that a proposition is true if it works, that that's the criterion of true, but they differ in their interpretation of what they mean by works. They agree that a proposition's truth is determined by its having desirable consequences, but the question is, what do you include in desirable consequences? Now let's look first at the Jamesian, openly subjectivist type of pragmatism. The Jamesian axis interprets terms like works, practical, desirable consequences, and so on, in a more or less openly subjectivist way. One vital element of the concept of works for them is that which yields emotional satisfaction, that which fulfills our subjective personal aspirations, yearning, desires. So from this point of view, they would say an idea works insofar as believing it yields the greatest emotional satisfaction over the long run. Now, just to contrast for a moment with that, the Peirce-Dewey axis, they reject this interpretation as too subjective and unscientific. For them, the practical consequences of an idea, what's allowed as working, has to be the same for everyone. And consequently, they don't count the emotional effects of believing an idea as part of the relevant consequences. So if you ask what they do count as working, it's points such as I've already hinted at. For instance, this is the Peirce-Dewey axis now. Suppose you're given two different theories to choose between, and you want to ask which one works from the Peirce-Dewey point of view. Well, suppose one of them makes actual predictions of future sensations, which do come to pass, whereas the predictions of the other one don't. Then they would say the first one works, the second one doesn't. The one strand of working would be making predictions about future experiences. Or suppose one theory ties together many different fields of knowledge, gives us a more organized, more systematic, more unified, more coherent intellectual world, so that everything fits together better if we accept it. Well, they will count that as one ingredient in it works. Or suppose two theories are equal in these respects, but one of them is simpler than the other. It posits fewer entities. It makes fewer assumptions than the other while still explaining the observed data. Then they will say the simpler theory works best. So when the Peirce-Dewey school talks about an idea working, they mean by working things like how simple is it, Does it have unifying, cohering power? Does it predict future sensations, etc.? Things of that order. The Jamesians, I may say, use all these criteria, but they also allow emotional consequences of accepting the idea. And you can see this difference between the two schools, or the two sub-wings of pragmatism, on their interpretation of belief in God. A typical Peirce Dewey type of pragmatist would say belief in God is out. God as such, he would say, is pragmatically meaningless because it makes no, the belief in God, he would say, makes no concrete predictions that we can test by sensory means. And therefore, from their point of view, it's pragmatically empty, it has no cash value, there's no specific sensations to be expected, it's simply meaningless. By the Jamesian type of pragmatist will say, we allow the emotional consequences of believing in God as part of its practical consequences. Now, suppose, for instance, this case, it's very dubious psychologically, but suppose just to illustrate the point, that if a person believes in God, he feels reassurance. He feels hope for the future. He feels safety. He goes to church. He hates atheists. And you can imagine a whole set of practical, emotional, and action-type consequences of believing in it. Then a Jamesian will say, well, believing in God has practical consequences for this person. It affects his emotional life and his actions, and it is therefore meaningful. Now you get the difference between these two views. Now, of course, the Jamesian view opens the door completely wide. Anything can be meaningful on this view if only it leads to some emotional consequences on you. So if I say I believe that there are elves in my television set, and every time it goes off, as a result of my belief in elves, I conduct a war dance, then it would be pragmatically meaningful because the cash value is that I run around and whoop, and therefore it's meaningful. Now, the Peirce Dewey school rebelled at that point. They thought that was too much, and Peirce, who had introduced the term pragmatism, when he saw the openly, crudely subjectivistic way that James was using it, decided to rename his theory, and he decided to call his theory pragmaticism, which he described as a term which is, quote, ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. Now you must, however, grasp on for speaking of the Jamesian viewpoint, the meaning of an idea is still the consequences. The meaning is the consequences. Therefore, if you believe in God, and you're a pragmatist, you believe in God pragmatically, that doesn't mean you believe there really is a God up there in heaven. If you're a pragmatist, it's irrelevant. More than that, it's unthinkable whether there really is a God in heaven. The proposition there is that God has to be translated into its practical consequences, and then it simply means its practical consequences. So, if the belief in God leads you to future experiences, certain emotions, certain actions, etc., what you are really thinking of when you believe in God is these later experiences, emotions, actions, and so on. That's actually it. The meaning is the cash value. One commentator put it, if belief in God results in an integrated personality, then God is the integrated personality. And when you believe in God, you're simply believing in the integrated personality. That's all. That's the cash value. That's the meaning. You have to get that clear, if you could. Now, if we look at for a moment at the Jamesian view, it's clear that what will emotionally satisfy an individual will vary from person to person. And the result, of course, will be that truth is thoroughly subjective and quote, individual on this viewpoint. Something can work for you and not for me, and consequently the same idea is true for you and not for me on the Jamesian interpretation. I might mention to you in this connection a famous article of James written in 1896 called The Will to Believe, which was written just a few years before he enunciated pragmatism. And in that article he argued But on most of the crucial issues confronting us, logic and objective evidence are non-existent. They don't point in either direction. For instance, on the question of God, he argued, you can't prove there is a God, you know this line, and you can't prove there isn't one. Logic has nothing to say about the issue one way or the other, and yet, he says, we have to commit ourselves. We have to believe one way or the other. Now, if you say to me, well, what about the principle of the onus of proof? Being on he who asserts the positive, James doesn't raise that, so I won't either. Suppose you say to me, well, but couldn't you just suspend belief? James would say no, because if you suspend belief, that amounts, practically speaking, pragmatically speaking, to atheism, so that's no way out either. So he says we're in the position constantly, and God is just an example, where we have to choose, and we have no evidence to guide our choice. What to do in such a case? Well, says James, in this, and this is typical of a vast number of situations, we have, he says, a right to believe whatever we personally want to believe. You simply have to make an effort, exert yourself, and will to believe. That was the title of his essay, the will to believe. Now you can, of course, decide, he says, to wait for scientific evidence and logical argument, if you want. But that is merely your subjective choice. That's what personally satisfies you. Now you see the rampant subjectivism involved in this viewpoint. If you want to believe it, and you will to believe it, that makes it true for you if it produces desirable consequences on you. And you can see James's own development here very simply. In 1896, when he wrote The Will to Believe, he said, objective truth is unattainable, therefore go out and satisfy your yearnings. A few years later, he said, let's make that into a philosophy. Let's redefine truth as that which satisfies our yearnings, which is the essence of his development. Schiller, I may say, is filled with this same type of rampant subjectivism. Here's one line from Schiller which can be multiplied at great length. Quote, the same predication may be true for me and false for you if our purposes are different. Unquote. That's a clear statement of the subjectivism of this type of pragmatism. Now let's look for just a moment in conclusion at the Dewey-Peirce interpretation. When we get to the Dewey-Peirce school, we have reached a different interpretation of pragmatism. Nothing annoys Dewey and his followers more than the charge of subjectivism. Dewey says repeatedly, nothing can be true for me and not for you. And he called his philosophy instrumentalism, as I mentioned, partly because he wanted to dissociate it from the Jamesian view that it's deuce is wild and you just go out and satisfy your yearnings. But now the Deweyan pragmatists have a problem here. Namely, if truth is what serves human purposes, how do we escape from subjectivism, from personal, private truth? Because after all, our purposes are variable. So you think that as a pragmatist you're committed to subjectivism. Well, the so-called scientific pragmatists came to answer this question as follows. They simply said this: let us permit as the relevant purposes here only those which are prevalent among men in general. Let's allow as true only what most men find works, and then no individuals or personalities will enter. The end of thought, says Dewey, is not, quote, some purely personal end, some profit upon which a particular individual has set his heart, unquote. Or again from Peirce, concluding a letter to James, quote, what is utility if it is confined to a single person? Truth is public, unquote. That's a typical pragmatist line. Truth is public. It's social. The true is what works for society, for a whole culture. Or as they sometimes put it, the true is not what satisfies this individual or that individual, but the community of scientists. Their conclusions, you see, are public, they're open to all, the private elements are purged out. Now you can see here, I think, without the need for further comment from me, the Kantian equation of the objective with the collectively subjective. The truth is objective because it's what works for the group collectively. And therefore, between the two schools of pragmatism, you really, in spite of the Dewey members' advocacy of alleged objectivity, you really are offered a choice of two types of subjectivism. The one side says to you, whatever your purposes are, whatever your particular emotions are, whatever satisfies them works and is true for you. And that's an avowed, open subjectivism, varying from individual to individual. The other side says, no, we have to take the purposes of mankind collectively as the standard, and whatever satisfies them is true, which is simply, of course, to take the group collectively as the standard and call that objective, a phenomenon which we saw in Kant. Now, this still leaves us with a number of questions about pragmatism. What's their view on logic? What's their ethics? What's their politics? What's wrong with it all? Because I made very few criticisms this evening. Those points we will continue with our discussion of pragmatism next week, and also throw in logical positivism. So we'll conclude now until next week. Thank you. Someone asked if I will distinguish between meaning and truth as those terms are used in a philosophic context. Broadly, meaning is the wider term. A proposition is said to be meaningful if it communicates some content, if it says something graspable, whether what it says is true or false. So both the true and the false are subdivisions in philosophy within the broader term meaningful. For instance, if I say there's an elephant on the table, that is meaningful. You can understand what I've said something, even though false. In fact, to be meaningful is a precondition of something being false. If I just say ish to triddle to troodle, that's neither true nor false, that's meaningful. So meaningful is contrasted with meaningless. And the essential distinction is, does it say something? Does it have a cognitive content or not? The alternative to meaningful is gibberish. Then within meaningfulness, there is a distinction between those propositions which are true and those which are false. As to the definition of true, of course, that depends upon the school of philosophy you're talking about. A pragmatist would say it's true if it works, it's false if it doesn't. It's meaningless if it doesn't have any practical consequences one way or the other. Someone wants me to tell a story about a mouse, which I once told at a lecture on pragmatism and left out tonight because of time. So I'll be glad to tell that story for what it's worth. It helps. It's in connection with the point of the pragmatist holding that reality is indeterminate prior to human investigation. When I first heard this as a graduate student at a university in New York, I did not believe at the time that anybody believed such things. I have since learned. But I asked the professor, there was a group of coats covering the wall, hanging on hooks, and I said, well, now, suppose we raise the question whether there is a mouse behind those coats. Isn't it the case that right now, prior to any human investigation, either there is a mouse or there isn't a mouse? See, that seemed to me, as I said, perfectly obvious statement, but that in either case, the state of affairs was determinate. If there was a mouse, there definitely was a mouse, and that was already decided. If there wasn't a mouse, there definitely wasn't a mouse, and that was already decided. And to my surprise, this was a class in which the professor and the overwhelming majority of the students were pragmatists. They vigorously denied my position. And you could not get them to say there is a mouse, and you could not get them to say there is not a mouse. What they kept saying is, the situation prior to investigation is indeterminate. I kept trying to say, well, you mean you don't know whether there's a mouse, but out there really is a mouse. And I could not get anywhere with them because they simply kept saying, we don't say there is a mouse and we don't say there isn't a mouse. We can't say anything about things apart from our investigation of them, see. And that was as far as I got with the mouse. If you try to appeal to the law of excluded middle, Aristotle's law of logic, which we'll look at next week and see how that fares in the pragmatist's hands, but just to anticipate for a moment and say, well, but look, by the laws of logic, either there is a mouse or there isn't. A typical pragmatist answer will be, there are no absolutes. How do you know the law of excluded middle is still holding up? We have to see whether it works. See? Now, if you get the method of this, that's the most I can communicate by this story. Now we have the question that's always asked about dying men. Pragmaticism would require that all ideas held by men in their deathbeds must be false for all men, since such ideas will not yield practical consequences for all men. Ideas held by dying men can have no consequences for dying men. And that's a variant of a question which is commonly asked, what happens if you're about to die, and the moment before your death, the thought flashes through your mind that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo and then you expire? Well, the mind is agency for formulating plans of action. This seems to be a clear-cut case where it wasn't doing that because it knows it's about to die and nevertheless had a thought. The only answer I have heard from pragmatists to this type of case, which I will leave you with, is the idea as formulated even in the mind of a dying man is practical but hypothetical. The meaning would be in effect like this. If I were to go on, then I would expect such and such future experiences. And that's the actual meaning. So if the man on his deathbed says arsenic will kill, he simply means if I were to go on living, I would expect future experiences of people dying when they take arsenic. But he's not going to go on, you see. So they simply interpret it as a hypothetical prediction about the future, although it has no practical value in this particular case. How did pragmatists explain how they could be certain that nothing was certain? Isn't this an absolute? Well, that's the problem, of course, that all skeptics have, and there is really no answer to this question, because if you can be certain of something, then the very means by which you acquired certainty of that would permit you, if properly applied, to be certain of anything else that's knowable. If you can't be certain of anything, then you get involved in the infinite regress of an obvious kind. There used to be philosophic discussions in the ancient world that illustrated this very clearly. There was, of course, Platonists and Aristotelians and so on, and they would all get together to talk, and there would be some skeptic in the crowd who would always come in and say no one can know anything for certain. So some follower of Plato or Aristotle or one of the other schools would say to him, well, are you certain of that? And he would say, well, no, I can't say I'm certain of that because you can't be certain of anything. But what I would say is it's very probable that you can't be certain of anything. So someone calls out, can you be certain of that? And then he says, well, I can say I'm certain of that. All I can say is it's very probable that it's very probable that you can't be certain of anything. And of course this goes on and on, one step at a time, and at a certain stage, the skeptic is standing in the corner saying it's very probable, and it's very probable, and it's very probable, and it's very probable, while the other philosophers are going on talking. And whenever he finishes, they just call out to him, and what about that? And he has to say the whole thing over again with one more, it's very probable that. As I remember, that was called the technique of reducing the skeptic to babbling. And in that sense, you cannot escape certainty. Let me take one or two that have been held over from preceding weeks. Here's one. Isn't Bentham's major error, not that he says that there are degrees of pleasure and seeks to measure same, which seems eminently reasonable, but rather that the activity is not dissociated from universal ethical hedonism. If I understand the thrust of this question, I would agree. In other words, there is nothing inherently fallacious in the attempt to apply measurement to emotions or emotional responses in general, or to pleasure as one particular type of response in particular. We do not have the means presently available to quantify pleasures in precise exact form and say that this particular experience was 6.4 units of ecstasy, whereas the other one was only 8.9 or whichever. But what we certainly can do even now is range emotional experiences along a quantitative continuum and say that this is much greater and this is much less. And this is discussed by Ms. Rand in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. So when I was critical of Bentham, I did not mean to imply, so I'm glad the question was asked, that pleasure as a phenomenon is immeasurable or outside the province of any form of quantitative measurement or relationship. The objection, of course, was you cannot quantify pleasures in the context of the type of theory of ethics that he was advocating, because he has no clear specification of what constitutes happiness or pleasure. And if you remember the discussion from last week, you have to take into account the arbitrary pleasures of the greatest number of people across all the future time. Now, I put it to you that there is no way of calculating what person will experience what degree of intensity, of what kind of pleasure, on what occasion, with what degree of probability, with what amount of fecundity and purity and propinquity and all those other characteristics, and do that for mankind as a whole with all the alternatives confronting you. That was the point I was objecting to. But I did not mean to imply that there is something wrong as such in any attempt simply to measure the intensity of a pleasure. That's not true. I'm alternating between 2 weeks, but there are some here I do want to get to. Well, this anticipates something we'll say next week, but I'll just answer briefly here. Is not the statement, if it works, it's true, an example of the stolen concept fallacy? It's counting on our understanding true properly. That is, that if it's true, it will work. Well, this is not, I think it's quite as clearly worded as it could be. You can put forth an unanswerable argument that pragmatism does commit the stolen concept fallacy and does in fact rely upon the correspondence theory of truth in order to maintain its position. But I think I won't develop that right now. I'll give you that as an intellectual assignment. See if you can establish for yourself before next time, and if you don't, I'll give it to you in the lecture, in what way a pragmatist, in order to apply his theory at all, must illicitly smuggle in the correspondence theory of truth, smuggle in a statement that this is the way things really are, in spite of his claim that he has dispensed with that. So I'll leave you with that question, which I promised to answer next week. If identity results from investigation and is indeterminate prior to this, what is the nature of existence in relation to one person who has not investigated and is unaware of the identity which has been assigned through the investigation of a second person or group of people? Well, that's a good question. And here, of course, the two schools that I mentioned would take two different views. The avowedly subjectivist type, the Jamesian type, would simply say, if you put on an interpretation that satisfies you, that's true for you, even if it doesn't have that status for the person who hasn't investigated. It simply is strictly subjective. The thing is, for you, what do you make it? And if somebody hasn't made it anything, then for him, it's indeterminate. And that simply is an application of the general subjectivism. The others, Peirce-Dewey type of school, would try to say, once competent scientists, however they define it, have put an interpretation that works on it, and that's the best we have, even if you personally haven't done the investigating, The decree of the competent scientists is what counts for now, because after all, they're competent scientists, and therefore they have given the theory that works best. So they would say, for instance, that if you don't know Einsteinian physics, it's still the case that Einsteinian physics works best and is true now for everyone, because if you only knew all the things the competent physicists did, you'd see that their particular interpretation worked also. So in other words, they would tend to say whatever interpretation is subscribed to by the scientific community is binding upon even ignorant people who haven't applied that interpretation. Now, but if I take this question literally, what is the nature of the existence in question? Pragmatists would bar that question. He'd say, I don't know what you mean by the nature of existence. I don't accept the view that there's existence out there within nature, and there's me in here, or us in here, and we're trying to discover their nature. There is simply sense data and interpretations that we place upon them. Very good question. Could you please review how, if one, all situations are indeterminate apart from man's sensory experiencing of them? Well, it's not just, I may say, his sensory experiencing, but apart from his conceptually interpreting. But if all situations are indeterminate apart from man's interpreting of them, and 2, reality is unknowable, irrelevant, unthinkable, and 3, man's consciousness creates identity, why wouldn't any idea formulated and acted upon produce desirable effects? In other words, you're asking the very excellent question, why do some ideas work and others don't? If reality is this malleable flux, we give it identity. Why is it the case that some ideas work and others don't? And now here, a real pragmatist will tell you, look, you have to start somewhere. Well, and there's the point of it. He'll say, you as an advocate of the primacy of existence will say, you must take certain things as a given. If you ask an advocate of objectivism, why is reality as it is? He will say, well, we take reality as the given. That's the primary fact. Existence exists, and then we go on from there. That's the primacy of existence view. Well, now on the primacy of consciousness view, you also start with something as the given. Namely, on the pragmatist interpretation of the primacy of consciousness, that certain things satisfy consciousness. Certain things work, and others don't. And that is just the irreducible primary. Now, you see, the reason that baffles you is because your idea is, well, but the reason the thing works is because of the way reality is, but that's not the pragmatist view. Their view is reality is the product of consciousness, and it happens to be the case that certain interpretations satisfy consciousness and others don't, and that's just the way things are, period. And we can't get any deeper than that, and therefore we can't ask the question, why do certain things work and others don't? They just do. In other words, they take the primacy of consciousness as their fundamental starting point. And they take the fact that certain things satisfy consciousness as simply irreducible. But of course, if you don't subscribe to the primacy of consciousness, then this question is entirely unanswerable. We should be able to make reality into anything we want, and consequently anything and everything should work. Scientific pragmatism considers the simplicity of an explanation a criterion of truth. Is the first criterion of simplicity valid? That depends entirely upon what you interpret the criterion of simplicity to mean. The criterion of simplicity was given its most famous formulation by a late medieval philosopher, William of Ockham. And it's often called Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is the proposition entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. That is to say, if you have two different theories, and both explain all the observed facts, and one of them makes an enormous construct of a whole bunch of complex, unobservable entities and assumptions, and the other makes many fewer assumptions, and they both explain the facts, then according to Occam's razor, you take the theory that makes the fewest number of assumptions and postulates the fewest number of entities. Now, if you interpret that in a sensible way, I would say that is a valid, although by no means the only, scientific criteria. Occam himself, for instance, introduced it because at the time that he was philosophizing, the world was filled with, not the world, the theories of the world were filled with references to angels and demons and ghosts and all kinds of occult figures which were supposed to be causing the phenomena we observe. And Occam said we can explain the world without reference to all these supernatural entities, so who needs them? They're useless. Entities shouldn't be multiplied beyond necessity. If I can explain a behavior of matter without reference to these entities, then it's entirely superfluous to do so. And this is a perfectly valid principle. It really is the principle that if there's no evidence for a complex construct, then you have no justification for it. You restrict yourself to the minimum required to explain a phenomenon. The only thing I would say before leaving this question is, the principle is entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. But if an entity is necessary, then of course you cannot interpret this principle as saying an explanation in terms of one thing is always superior to an explanation in terms of two things, because sometimes two things are necessary. I mention this, for instance, because, to take just one type of case, there are many materialists who use this alleged principle of simplicity to defend materialism. And they say, we can't explain everything by reference simply to matter. Why should we bring in mind in addition? See? Now I say if you use Occam's razor that way, in fact you can't explain everything, but you're cutting your throat with Occam's razor. And you have to be very careful not to do that. But if you interpret it sensibly, that you have no right to hypothesize an entity which is not necessary to explain a particular phenomenon, then you do not have to be a pragmatist to subscribe to that viewpoint. How can one reason with a pragmatist when one is trying to protect a value? I'm not sure I understand that question. In fact, I'm sure that I don't understand that question. I would put it more broadly. How could you reason with a pragmatist in general? You would have to try to bring the question down to fundamentals. The first thing you would have to do is establish for him that there is a reality and that human beings have the faculty of awareness of it, and that A is A. And if you could lay down that much of a basis, then of course you will have collapsed the foundations of his viewpoint. Until you could lay down that kind of basis, it would be hopeless to discuss values with him, because every key concept upon which your discussion would rest, truth, knowledge, etc., would just be whisked out from under you, and you'd have no foundation at all. So you'd have to convert him on metaphysics and epistemology before you could discuss any practical or value type of phenomenon. As to how you would do that, I may say I have had conspicuous lack of success personally in attempting to argue with pragmatists, because a philosophy starts somewhere, and if a philosophy begins with the premise of the primacy of consciousness and does not recognize the absolutism of logic, then by its own statement there is no means by which you can objectively argue. You can't refer to the facts, because as soon as you say fact, they say fact is what works, etc. As soon as you say logic, logic is what works, and since what works is such a woozy concept, as we'll see later, you can get a straight statement out of them. And consequently, I would say your only hope would be try and start and lay down a metaphysical foundation, but how you will do that, I can't say. Now I have some from last week. I've been saving these on the premise that we should get to some of these. Inasmuch as Ayn Rand describes herself as a man-worshipper, could you sharply distinguish the implication of her use of this term in its several aspects from the ideas held by Comte? And I would certainly be very eager to make this distinction, because remember, Comte said we should have a religion of humanity. There are so many points I wouldn't know even where to begin here, but to indicate just a few. First, to make the general point, Ayn Rand describes herself as a man worshipper. This is radically opposed to any Comtean positivist religious use of the term of worshiping mankind collectively to begin with. Comte construes humanity as a collectivist organism. All men together jumbled into one supernatural creature, and you're supposed to fall on your feet before this creature and feel awe and reverence. Now, when Ayn Rand talks about worshiping man, she is talking about the abstraction man, not the collective humanity put together in one totality. And that means, practically speaking, the individual man insofar as he lives up to the nature of man and fulfills the values that are rational. It's like, the difference is like this. Suppose I say books are a great thing. Books, just take that. I say I'm an admirer of books. Now, it's one thing to say that means there's a certain type of entity, book, which, properly executed, can live up to a certain potential and have enormous value. In which case, you're a book admirer. You like that type of phenomenon. But that imposes very stringent requirements, because you have some set of values. And you say, if you like books, you like them for specific reasons, and that means a terrific number of books you will think will be god-awful, will be rotten. And you will like certain particular individual books because they live up to the nature of this type of entity, the communication of knowledge or whichever. It doesn't mean, if you're a book admirer, that therefore you embrace all books and all libraries collectively, stick them into one heap, call them a super book, and fall on your knees before it, which is the Comtean view in relation to man. You get the distinction. Of course, there are so many other points. Ayn Rand holds that even in admiring any particular individual man, he has to earn your admiration and approval by achieving specific values. What she admires as man as he can be and ought to be, not simply the conglomeration of men as they happen to be, which is the Comtean view. And of course, for her, worship has no religious, supernatural, mystic significance. It simply means a very high, exalted form of valuing, but is completely irrational. Whereas for Comte, of course, worship was a term standing for an emotional, mystical, non-rational, supernatural type of orientation, the sort of attitude that you had toward God, or that men had toward God in the medieval period. And then, of course, the means of expressing your valuation of man are radically different, again, in these two views. Ayn Rand holds that if man is a value, he should not be sacrificed. Comte holds, in order to express your admiration for mankind, every individual should sacrifice himself. So that in every respect, what the object of the admiration, the nature of it, the grounds of it, the processes of expressing it, they are complete antitheses across the board. Do we have any brief ones on pragmatism? How can any pragmatist ever reject his admittedly tentative, i.e. dubitable theory of pragmatism? If he rejects it because it doesn't work, he continues to embrace pragmatism. Well, in other words, if I understand you, you're simply saying that it is no use arguing against a pragmatist that it doesn't work, although it's true that it doesn't work, because that will concede his basic premise that the true is that which works. It may give him pause, however, if you show him that it doesn't work, which I think is a true point. If you wanted, therefore, to reject, to postulate a case in which a pragmatist rejected pragmatism, you would have to imagine that you had convinced him to abandon the fundamentals which led him to his particular definition of truth. Now, the definition of truth does not come out of the blue. It came via various historical sources, some of which I tried to indicate tonight. What you really would have to do is convince him that Kant doesn't have a leg to stand on, that reality exists and is knowable by man, by human reason, knowable with certainty. And if you could establish that, then the whole idea, the whole basis for defining truth in terms of what works would be pulled out from under him, and you may have a hope. But that's all. According to pragmatists, how should scientists proceed in their work? Why do scientists make such elaborate pretenses as if the outcome of the experiment was not determined by them? I.e., scientists can't appeal to a pre-existent community of scientists. Well, the pragmatists, of course, advocate a number of details of scientific procedure, such as experimental method, verification, and so on. As far as I'm concerned, this is all a stolen concept on their part, because given their metaphysical view, there is no reason why we should go through any particular procedure at all. This harks back to an earlier question. If reality is indeterminate and we confer identity upon it, why should we have to go through the tortuous, detailed procedures that experimental and theoretical scientists go through? All of those procedures are possible only on the premise that there is a reality out there, that you have to go through a definite method if you're to arrive at it, and that you'd be wrong if you don't. Now, insofar as pragmatists advocate this, they are actually contradicting their own philosophy. And in this sense, I think James is a much more consistent type than the Deweyan type, because they'll say what's true for you isn't true for me. So I think that the implication of this question is correct, that scientists should not have to go through any particular method if pragmatism were true. Now, the end of it says scientists can't appeal to a pre-existing community of scientists. I have to tell you, in a way they do, according to pragmatists, at least judged by the following, and I'll conclude tonight on this story. I was in a class, again, I took many classes from pragmatists, because the place where I went happened to be filled with pragmatists. And at one point, the professor defined matter. And he was a pragmatist, and he defined matter as that which physicists study. That was the definition of matter, that which physicists study. So I raised my hand and I said, how do physicists know what to study? This is matter, that by definition which they study. How do they decide? And he, without batting an eye, said, they find out from other physicists. And I said, well, what about, those and so on? And he said, they find out from still earlier ones. And I said, and I swear this is an exact replay of the dialogue. I said, what about the first physicist? And there was a pause, and he looked at me and he said, there was no first physicist. So I called out, well, then was the second one first? And he said, yes. On that note, we can conclude tonight. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 8.